Okay, I finished off yesterday. Was it yesterday or on Wednesday? Anyway, I finished off by talking about Vietnam and the United States' involvement in that. Now, Vietnam is direct intervention. This is what we could pinpoint as being a real important moment in US foreign policy. Even Korea, the United States could claim that, no, we're not acting unilaterally. We're not acting on our own. Why not? What was different with Korea? Joe?
It was the United Nations.
Good. It was the United Nations. Incidentally, just a bit of background. I didn't mention this last lesson, but I quite like it as a sign of how international institutions, when Russia gets it wrong, in this case, they were unhappy about China not being recognized by the United States, the new communist government in China. So their response was to boycott the UN Security Council. What the Soviet Union didn't understand is that if there's a vote in the Security Council and you're not there, you're just counted as being abstaining, which means you've decided not to cast a vote, rather than your absence being considered a no vote. And the UN Security Council, as it still does today, operates on a policy of everyone has a veto. So if the resolution went to the UN Security Council to say, we'll intervene with military force in response to the aggression of the communist North in Vietnam, in Korea, sorry. If the Russians had been there, they could have said, no, we don't agree, and there could have been no UN force. Which would have meant that if America did want to get involved, they would have had to get involved as America, not as the UN force. So the Soviets learnt from that, and in effect, that basically crushes the UN for the rest of the Cold War, because the USSR makes sure they have always got somebody on the UN Security Council for any vote, and anything proposed by the United States or France or Britain or anyone from the West, they just go, veto, and block everything, which is the reason why these different incidents that we look at across the rest of the 20th century, the UN just doesn't really seem to be a factor. And that's why, because there was no option to use a UN force, because Russia would veto everything. Okay? So Vietnam, therefore, it is a very good example of, to summarize, and I know I brought this up at the end of last lesson, but just to shape us as to where we are at this stage. The United States, sorry, bad slip to make, commits to defending the South Vietnamese from what it sees as North Vietnamese aggression. It is a Chinese and Soviet, but largely China, backed attempt to be a catalyst for what's called the domino theory. Anyone know what the domino theory is?
It's how, like, if one country falls to communism, the neighbouring country will.
Good, absolutely. Now, bear in mind that we're looking at a geopolitical map where you've got communist Soviet Union, communist China. It's very feasible that the countries, particularly Southeast Asian countries, could go the way that the satellite states have done in Eastern Europe. And then you'd have a communist bloc within Asia, which then turns itself, potentially its attention to other countries of the region, like Japan, like India, which the United States is very, very keen does not turn communist, especially as those countries are edging towards the oil-producing countries that the United States realizes is going to be so important. They don't want a communist Iran or a communist Saudi Arabia. Okay? So we get the United States getting involved. It is another example of the United States supporting a country based on them being anti-communist, rather than them being particularly good examples of liberal capitalist democracy. The leader of South Vietnam is not a good ruler, is not a fair democratic ruler, even to the extent that President Kennedy allegedly, there is historical record, but all these things get challenged, that he was aware that there was going to be a coup to take power from him, and he let it happen. He didn't intervene because he actually thought this could be a good thing for us. So in effect, we're talking about South Vietnam is pretty much a military dictatorship. The United States is supporting them with direct involvement of the US forces. It does not go well. Guerrilla warfare, I'm not going to start now on why Vietnam doesn't work, but you can certainly, those of you, if you do choose to include it as part of your NEA, will probably enjoy looking into that. But it is a catastrophe, and there are lessons to be learnt for the United States. When they have occupied a policy of not cooperating and not having a dialogue with the Soviet Union, we've ended up over a relatively short period of space with the Cuban Missile Crisis and being dragged into a war that they really don't want to be involved in. So the mood in America over the course, and I say in America, the mood amongst the American administrations over the course of the 1960s is we need to find a way to coexist with the communist nations. We need to improve relations. All the time, of course, they commit to the fact that they're going to make sure that any opportunity to undermine and to challenge and to reduce the power and influence of those nations, they will take. But they certainly are going to try and improve the relationship. And that's called détente, which you'll hopefully remember a little bit from GCSE. Détente, that idea of cooling down the heat of the contrast and getting on. That's what détente means. So this leads, and particularly under a different president in Richard Nixon, who replaces Lyndon Johnson. Johnson actually decides not to go for another term of office. Such was the strain and the pressure upon him of Vietnam, which, given that Johnson was an extremely tough character, is one that sums up just how difficult leadership can be in trying times. But what the United States decide to do as their policy is they kind of pivot. They realize and they recognize that the biggest fear that the Soviet Union have is of China and the United States cooperating. Because as luck would have it, and it is luck, it's not by design, the Chinese and the Soviets hate each other, to the extent that in the late 1960s, there are border skirmishes. So in theory, had they developed, you could have had the Soviet Union at war with China, which seems absurd because they're both communist countries. But when the Soviet Union, under Khrushchev, makes it clear that we are not in favor of how Stalin operated, the leader of China, Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, is a Stalinist. And the Chinese increasingly feel that the Soviets only talk about the communist brotherhood when it suits them and when they're in control. And of particularly tension is the Chinese claim that the Soviets promise to provide them with nuclear technology, and the Soviets never do. So relations between them isn't good. So one of the issues that China has had is a significant famine in the 1960s, the Great Leap Forward, etc. By all means, go and look into Chinese history. It's fascinating, but as you can probably tell, I'm trying not to go down too many tangents, is that you end up with a situation where relations are so bad between Soviet Union and China that the United States decide that the best way to encourage the Soviets to come to the table and have a dialogue with America is to scare them by improving relations with China. So you can see there, Richard Nixon, I have a lot of sympathy with. That is very much me in a Chinese restaurant or a South Asian cuisine restaurant when the chopsticks come out, because it's not one of my strengths. I can sort of get there, but it's pretty much by like you fashioning it as some kind of scoop. It's not, I'll be honest, watching me eat isn't exactly a pleasurable experience at the best of times. But watching me try and eat with chopsticks is like a horror film. So Nixon's face there of, how are you managing to do that? I think is lovely. But Nixon visits China. And Nixon visiting China is an incredibly significant moment. I would argue that Nixon visiting China deserves to be recognized as a major turning point in the 20th century. Because in effect, bear in mind that China, up until the end of the 1960s, the Chinese communist state was not even recognized as the legal government of China by the United States, nor by the UN, because the US used their veto. So this bizarre circumstance existed where the Chinese representative at the United Nations was actually the exiled government of Taiwan, who had not been even in China since the 1940s. Now, relations between the United States and China, there was lots they disagreed on, but what policy the United States went for, which was an effective and very shrewd policy, was to let's ignore what we disagree on, let's look at where we can help each other. So there are attempts to improve trade with China, to provide food to China during famine, to offer technology to China. In return, as we very much have seen the products of over the last 30 years, the Chinese, mainly under a later guy called Deng Xiaoping, but they start to recognize that there's something in this capitalism thing. So China start coming out of isolation themselves and start trading. And essentially what you're saying to America once China start trading is good news, everybody. We've now got a new market of over 1 billion people who've never watched Disney films and who've never tried Coca-Cola and haven't eaten McDonald's. So it provides an enormous new market for America, which economically is of just incalculable benefit. It really is a major advantage for them. Okay. And now, of course, to pivot to the modern age, we have situations where America's pride and joy, Disney, are actively aiming for the Chinese market by producing the live action version of Mulan and certainly changing some of the parts of it that were critical and could be seen as critical of China. You've also got the new Marvel one, which is set in China, which looks great. But the idea of they're very much aiming at the Chinese market. Okay. So to come back to the 1970s, the impact of this is the United States' involvement in China. They're continuing to be closely involved with Japan, although as the recovery of Japan from the Second World War was so good, by the time we get into the 70s and into the 80s, America's starting to nervously look at Japan as an economic rival. Jobs are going to Japan. Now, when we're talking about, you could argue that the story, at least in business terms, of the latter period of the 20th century, you take 1970s onwards and the story is computers and televisions, is technology. And Hitachi, Sony, Samsung, it is the Japanese who are mastering these electronics. And that creates a threat to the US economy. Okay? But you've now got America and Asia involved in Japan, improving its relations with China, and it has a knock-on effect of leading to the Soviet Union coming to terms with America and saying, okay, we can't let you go off and become best buds with China, so we need to improve our relationship, which leads to some significant improvements in the relationship between America and the Soviet Union. It leads to things like the arms control agreements of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. It leads to things like the Apollo-Soyuz mission, where they have a collaboration in space. You have the Helsinki Accords, where led by the two different groups, the Eastern Bloc, the Western Bloc, come together and make some agreements on security, human rights, trade. But it's important not to sugarcoat this too much and suggest that this is a dramatic pivot to America having a solely positive relationship with Russia. They still are committed to reducing communist influence around the world. Some historians argue that still represents containment. Others would say they've moved beyond that. But in countries like Latin American countries like Chile, Argentina, Brazil, wherever it might be, the United States is looking to counter and prevent the spread of communism. Because a development in the 20th century that perhaps hasn't grabbed your attention as much, but is very significant, is decolonization. The story of the 19th century is the British Empire, the French Empire, the German Empire, the Belgian Empire. The story of the 20th century is those empires falling apart and those countries leaving the colonies. In some cases, literally getting up and going and saying, sort yourselves out, which is what the Belgians do. Which is why the Belgians are bad people. But anyway, it's just a personal view perhaps. But look at Rwanda, look at the Congo, look at the areas of West Africa and East Africa that were Belgian colonies. And that's where you'll find the problems that still continue to this day. Anyway, back to the main focus. As the great powers can no longer afford, they're no longer great powers for a start, as the French, the British, etc., can no longer afford to have these empires, the colonies become independent, and that presents an opportunity. Because in the vacuum of power left by the imperial powers, here comes a Soviet businessman or representative of their country or an American and says, hi, we'd like to give you loads of money to have influence in your country, please. So countries like India become at the heart of, are they going to be friendly to America? Are they going to be friendly to the Soviet Union? So in effect, countries in Latin America, countries in Asia, countries in Europe, but to a lesser extent, the Soviets and the Americans are very keen to have a good relationship with those countries. And to come back to the aspect of the United States being focused on anyone but the communists, this is in Chile. I think might need to double check that. I think this is in Chile. Basically, it's a sign that what happens in Latin America and South America is some very, very bad individuals are able to be supported in coming into power with the help of the CIA on the agreement that they will not turn to communism. So you have, for example, in Chile, there is a President Allende, who is a socialist, he's a communist, who's in charge in Chile, democratically elected. The CIA act to orchestrate and support a coup, a military coup, to remove him from power and install what in effect is a right-wing dictatorship under a guy called General Augusto Pinochet. And when I say bad, I know that I don't like to use words like good and evil in history, as you know, but to give a bit of context, he would execute people in the middle of sports stadiums and leave their bodies hanging in the changing rooms. So anybody who came to use those facilities would be reminded of this is what happens when you go against the government. Not a nice man. But America actively supports these countries and these dictatorships, which is what they are, because they're not communist, and to preserve American influence. And this ends up very much being the story of America's involvement in Latin America in particular. Yes?
They still do it today?
Yes, to be honest, to an extent.
Like Venezuela.
Yes, yeah, completely. Now, it's not as clear cut as the example I've given there. I think Chile is a very much more, Chile is one to look at, but definitely the CIA continues to involve itself all over the world. Sometimes for good, sometimes for harm. There is certainly all kinds of debates you can have about it. As a purist, you would say they should not be getting involved in other countries and they should be respecting democracy. As a challenge to that, a country where the United States, despite encouragement, steadfastly refused to be involved in was Syria, which opened a vacuum for Bashir to become in charge there, to have Russian involvement, and that country is an absolute mess. And thousands upon thousands of people have lost their lives because of the problems there. So this is always a difficulty when it comes to America's role. Often, a lot in the news recently because of Afghanistan. People resent America getting involved in the affairs of other countries, and I completely understand why, and I'm not in any way advocating that process. However, one of the stories perhaps of the 20th century that is dangerously being forgotten is when America goes, fine, we won't get involved then. There will be other countries who will get involved, who won't necessarily be quite as interested in keeping the body count down as the United States are. Because as a democracy, you're always answerable. If things go wrong, it could well be that next election, the Democrats get defeated. Or certainly if Joe Biden stands again for a second term, which personally I don't think he will, but I have no say in that. If he does, it could be that the seeming humiliation of the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Taliban regaining power, that might be what loses him the election. Ultimately, Vladimir Putin doesn't need to worry about that. He will definitely get in because he fixes the election. And in China, no, Xi cannot be replaced. The only way that Xi can be replaced is by the Communist Party removing him. There's no democracy, there's no choice. So countries getting involved in other countries' affairs who aren't even answerable to their own people doesn't often go very well. But anyway, I've digressed a little bit, but it is relevant to this because this is the background. Okay, so that was Chile. This is Vietnam. This is how Vietnam ends. Again, you've probably, if you've seen the news over the last couple of weeks, seen this photo quite a lot. It's a very famous photo. It's the last flight out of Saigon. It is when the North Vietnamese are taking control of Vietnam. These are the last remaining people in Americans working in South Vietnam, being part of supporting it, escaping. And this was very much has been, compared and contrasted to the scenes at Kabul airport as the Americans withdrew. This does not play well around the world. It was definitely viewed as, by people like Ronald Reagan, as a embarrassing demonstration of America's cowardice and refusal to lead. So you're going to see in your reading and your research a backlash to this, the Vietnam effect. Again, in the power of words, the guy who replaces Nixon as the president is the opposite. It could not be more than anti-Nixon. Now, there is an interim president, a guy called Gerald Ford, because for reasons I won't go into, but I'm very happy to discuss with you if you're interested in it. Nixon has to resign from office because it turns out that he was a massive crook. And basically, when there is the next chance there is for an election, the Republicans, which Nixon was a Republican, they get defeated by the Democrats. And the Democrat candidate is pretty much the polar opposite of Nixon. He's a peanut farmer, Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter is very much about a moral, fair, reasonable foreign policy. Okay, completely different to what we have seen under Richard Nixon. Quite the opposite. Okay. Now, what Nixon, as his final acts, as it were, before his legacy ends, he's left office. Jimmy Carter's on his way, but there is a final attempt for the gains that Americans are trying to make in foreign policy to be underpinned. And you can see here in the middle, looking not very well, because at this time he was very, very much had a serious problems with substance abuse and alcohol. You've got Leonid Brezhnev on the left, and the guy next to him is Gerald Ford, who is he was the American president. He's a vice president who got given the role afterwards. And this is after the SALT II agreements have been signed, have been proposed, and agreed, which is going to mean that the United States and the Soviet Union have agreed another arms agreement, which is more wide-ranging than the first one. However, it does not come to pass. It is not ratified by US Congress because of the actions of the the Soviet Union. Partly added into this is Iran. Now, Iran is a country we can class it as Asia, in the Middle East, and in Iran, Americans were taken hostage. There's a magnificent film about it called Argo, which is really, really good. Ben Affleck directing and starring. I know it doesn't sound like it'd be very good, but it really is. It's a brilliant film. Won an Oscar deservedly. But what happens is that the American embassy is stormed and hostages are taken. So there was a rising threat to America in the Middle East. from countries which may have some relations to the Soviets, but there was also a growing influence of what we call political Islam, of a rejection of the West, something which has been obviously very much has characterized the late 90s and the noughties, as it were. So we get America again embarrassed on the world stage, with American civilians being seemingly taken hostage, and the American government seem powerless to do anything about it. So we are going to get a reaction to this. The reaction to this in America, I'll come back to that in a moment, is the election of a guy called Ronald Reagan, who is portrayed there with the cowboy hat. It's a lovely map, actually, of what the situation is of the world in the 1980s. If you can't see it very clearly, obviously it's incredibly rude. South America is just completely described as drug pushers, Libyan terrorists, good commies in Great Chow Mein, that's China. Quite rudely, Australia is just dismissed as kangaroos. Japan is now shaped like a car and called Japan Inc. because it is just an industry. It's quite a good one to look at. That I'll share it on there. It's a fantastic source. I really like it. But Reagan is the opposite to Carter. He's actually very different to what's come before, because Reagan comes in and he sees the world very simply. Not that he's not intelligent. He's a very, very intelligent man. But he believes that complexity muddies the waters. And he makes it quite clear. He describes the Soviets as an evil empire. And he says that our aim is not to coexist with communism, it's to defeat it. This is added onto the fact that when he survives an assassination attempt, he believes, as an evangelical Christian, that he has been saved. It is not his time to go to heaven yet, because he hasn't defeated the communists yet. So Reagan completely prioritizes, if you are anti-communist, you are my friend, and really pushes an aggressive assault on communism all around the world, which means doubling down on support for regimes which might not be particularly kind. We see, for example, in Nicaragua, there is funding for a not great group of people called the Contras. There's an attempt to support them to prevent left-wing groups succeeding in democratic elected government there. They double down on that. They invade Grenada, which is in South America, as a demonstration that we will act, we will use our military when we feel it's appropriate. Okay? So Reagan brings a very, very different angle to US foreign policy. Whether in practice it's any different, that's for you to decide. When you look behind the bluster and look at what America actually does that much change? I'm not sure. But something that does change, that affects American policy greatly, is this. This is Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan had a communist leadership. The communist leader was challenged. So in an attempt to put another communist leader in charge, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. This therefore led to a response, what we might call a rebellion from a group called the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen are essentially Islamic freedom fighters, and because they are enemies of the communists, the Americans fund them. So in Afghanistan, in Asia, and they pay for their arms, they pay to train them, they offer them what they need to run an insurgency guerrilla warfare campaign against the Americans. If we look fast forward in history, this doesn't go particularly well, because part of these Mujahideen, an individual who was very well thought of in the Mujahideen and who was trained extremely efficiently in planning and munitions, was a guy called Osama bin Laden, a Saudi who was over there. So there were major problems in the future consequences of what happened. Also in this period in Asia, to reflect American policy towards, if you are against the Soviets, you are friends of us. The Iranians, who had a good relationship with the Soviets, when a war breaks out between Iran and Iraq, the Americans back the Iraqis, and they offer support and funding and describe as a freedom fighter a man by the name of Saddam Hussein, who by the end of the 1980s, they have a very different view of. But it really underlines this idea of my enemy's enemy is my friend. And we are going to do what is necessary to succeed and to challenge you. The relationship with China in the 80s continues to be positive, to the extent that when the Chinese carry out their own internal lockdown, Tiananmen Square, where they respond to student pro-democracy protests by gunning them down on the streets and using tanks, the United States firmly condemns the actions but doesn't do anything else. So again, just thinking about our slant on it, is it economic motivations trumping what might be a more moral foreign policy? Possibly so. Okay. Now you can see here that this is a demonstration of Reagan's views towards Central America, and he will stop at nothing. Is imposing for photo op with a T-shirt that someone's got there. You might recognize there the font and the white type on a red background. That is not an accident. That is exactly what Trump and Trump supporters ripped off with Make America Great Again. They used Reagan's messages, how it was communicated, although believe me, obviously, sadly, Reagan's now dead, but from what I know of Reagan and from my research on him, which is actually quite extensive because I did a lot on Reagan at university, he would not have liked Donald Trump one bit. So please don't sort of collate the two as being similar. Moving on, we get a huge amount of protests towards Reagan for what's seen as his warmongering, but actually in different countries, Reagan is seen as something of a hero because he is supporting their attempts to gain freedom from oppression, particularly in Eastern Europe, where money is sent and used to fund the campaigns, like in Poland, the Solidarity Group, who ultimately overthrow the communist government, and it leads to the collapse of the Soviet Union. During this period, there is a very fortunate, although you could argue nothing in history is by chance, but in the Kremlin, which is what we call the equivalent of the White House of the Soviet Union, a reformer comes in called Mikhail Gorbachev, and Reagan and Gorbachev have a very positive and prosperous relationship. Very good for Reagan because pretty much everything Gorbachev does helps Reagan's plans to weaken the Soviet Union. But Gorbachev's reforms are aimed at bringing in freedom of speech and reforming the economy, things that Reagan can very much get behind. And in Europe, although this has repercussions across the world, we have the shadow of communism across Europe starts to fade, most famously shown by the Berlin Wall coming down. Although I always think it's interesting to reflect on how America responds to the news of the fall of the Berlin Wall is with absolute panic, because they worry that it's going to lead to a kind of potential civil war across Europe, because they weren't in control of the decisions of when the Berlin Wall comes down. As I mentioned, Tiananmen Square, we have the situation where pro-democracy protesters are on the streets and the Chinese government order a clampdown on them, which the United States, other than condemning them, does not do a great deal about. So I am just speeding up a little bit. You can see here, this is in Iraq. Okay, this is George H. Bush, president at the end of the 1980s, and his wife, Barbara Bush. By the end of the 1980s, Saddam Hussein has gone, to a pretty significant extent, has gone rogue, and Saddam Hussein invades a neighboring country called Kuwait. And because he's after the oil and the riches, so the UN, with the Soviets not blocking this and even offering support, although we don't get full sort of Russian soldiers fighting alongside Americans, but they are technically on the same side. The world rises to challenge the aggression of Saddam Hussein, and a predominantly American force, there were lots of Brits and Australians and other countries, even Syrians, fought to push the Iraqis out of Kuwait and force Saddam Hussein to back down. Okay, so we kind of end on a bit of a positive there in Asia, where the United States are, well, they would see it as positive. They are leading global efforts to deter aggression. Now, the last time we saw the United States leading a United Nations group in deterring aggression was Korea. And Korea is 1950. This is basically 40 years later. So the first time it happens again. So it certainly is a sign that perhaps America's aims haven't changed, just how they achieve them has. Okay, right. Now, that brings us to what you are going to be answering your coursework on. Now, in effect, we've got 4 questions that you could do. To what extent did the United States pursue an interventionist foreign policy towards Europe in the period 1890 to 1991? Okay. That's across the whole of what you studied now. We've reached the end, as it were, of the build-up period. Obviously, there's aspects of the 1890 to 1991 that you are more confident on than others, but that's what your research is going to be. So you could choose that question. You're going to be looking at how American policy towards that region changes. You're going to be, and I will go into all this in more detail next week, but you're going to be choosing some historians to focus on. What did they think about this? Where do they disagree? And ultimately, you're going to come to a decision and answering to what extent was America's foreign policy interventionist. You also have the option of doing that instead for Asia. So you're going to be looking at Asia as a region of the world. That will come in with their policy towards Japan, towards China, towards Vietnam. Okay. You might also bring the Middle East in there and Afghanistan. You could focus on Latin America. Latin America, thinking about what we class as Cuba and downwards. Now, I've just added at the bottom there, to what extent did the US pursue an interventionist foreign policy towards Central America and the Caribbean? You'll see that I've called them both question 3. That's not by accident. That's a student 2 years ago, was it 3? 3 years ago, who, using these questions, she was writing about Latin America, and she basically found that she was so focused on Central America and the Caribbean, and had done really good work. She asked, could I do it on Central America and the Caribbean? So I checked with the exam board, and they're okay with that. So I've just added that in there, as there is an option, but ultimately, Latin America, you can include Cuba as part of Latin America, and in effect, Latin America is the region that I would be suggesting going for. This individual had sort of family links to the area and had quite a lot of quite niche knowledge about the Caribbean and their history, which is absolutely fine. I went with it. I was excited about it. Well done. But I would guard against, if you really want to, that's fine. If you can justify it, I would guard against thinking about Central America and Caribbean. I would say your decision really is about those 3 questions. Which region are you going to go for? Europe, Asia, or Latin America? Now, you don't have to decide right this moment, but what you are, I'll come on to that next week. I am going to expect you to be needing to make a decision reasonably quickly so we can get cracking with it. So over the next week or so, I will be giving you next week I'll be sharing it as an assignment actually on there, but I'll give you a paper copy as well. You're going to basically deliver to me a proposal. So you're not just going to say, I quite fancy Asia because I love going to Wagamamas. I need a bit more than that. So you're going to plan, basically work out yourself. Are you clear on what it is you're going to be attempting here? So if you decide Latin America, the form which I'll go through will be right. Which historians are you thinking about reading? What's your hypothesis at this stage without knowing it in the depth that you're going to know it? What do you think would be your answer? I need to make sure that you've thought about it, because what I don't want and what I can't have, to be honest, in terms of time, is for you to launch into doing one of them and then turn around in November and say, sir, can I do Asia instead, please? So it's better to really think about it now. Okay, so if you like, coming up to the next week is our thinking week, reflecting on the work you've already done over the past, the bookends of the end of last year and the start of this year, with getting an overview of foreign policy and really thinking about it. So that's what we'll get stuck into next week. You don't need to do anything in preparation for that now. As I say, I'll see you next week and we'll go through it and we'll get stuck into it. But you can start thinking about it, obviously. And by the end of next week, you will be pretty clear, 99% clear, I hope, on which region you're going to focus on. And then I can start introducing you to how you're going to go about researching and writing it, which is the really fun part. Okay, right. I won't take questions on it now because I suspect that you're going to have plenty of questions as we go through it next week. So that is the end of the lesson. I will upload the recording for this bit on there